and thank you all for joining us for this really exciting event, which is part of the nationwide Art History Festival organised by the Association for Art History and which also relates to the exhibition Ancient India Living Traditions at the British Museum. I'm Sushma Jansari, Early South Asia Curator at the British Museum and also curator of that show. And I am so pleased to be joined by Dr Anjana Khatwa for this event. Anjana is an award-winning earth scientist and she specialises in bringing stories about the origins and formation of natural landscapes to life for a wide range of audiences, including all of us today. Her debut non-fiction book, The Whispers of Rock, Stories from the Earth, came out just the other week on the 4th of September, and it tells a global story of how rock has shaped our world and our lives. I have a copy right here with me, and it is fascinating. For this particular event, Anjana is going to give us a 30-minute presentation that explores some themes from her book, and many of which connect to the exhibition too. And then after that, she and I will have a 20-minute discussion that more closely focuses, I'd say, on some sacred images carved in rock, of course, from the Ancient India Living Traditions exhibition. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sushma, for that very, very generous introduction. I'm here really to talk about spirituality in nature and how that intersects with science in the most extraordinary and beautiful ways. As Sushma introduced me, I'm an earth scientist, so I tell stories about rocks, fossils, and landforms. And I've done this through a variety of different ways on television, on radio, and more recently in this amazing book that I've had such a privilege in writing. Let's kick off with this kind of sense about how we feel about rock and landscape in our own lives. Because as I've been writing this book, and certainly as I've been working as an earth scientist across much of my career, which spans about 2 decades, I felt that in the Western world, we've lost this sense of connection with rock. But if we look across the world, and particularly at the Ancient India exhibition, we get a sense that there are global communities that still have a sense of connection, and particularly a spiritual connection with rock and landscape. And this beautiful photograph of me with some sandstones at the Petra archaeological site really kind of demonstrates how much I love rock and what it means to me, because when I'm placing my hand on that rock itself, it is an actual quite a spiritual experience for me, because I can connect with the rock and its story. This particular formation dates back to 500 million years ago, when rivers were flowing over an ancient desert, which is now Jordan. And these beautiful sandstones were deposited by those rivers flowing over a landscape that was devoid of vegetation, so the river could dance wherever it wanted to. And as those sand grains came to rest, they eventually became cemented to form these beautiful bedded structures that you can see in that photo. It really is one of the most extraordinary places I've ever been. If we travel across the world, we can also see how different Indigenous communities and people have revered and looked at the landscape through spiritual lenses. This is Kora Ruapeu in Te Ika, Maui, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this mountain, which is also a stratovolcano, the Maori see this as a manifestation of Ruamoko, who was the god of earthquakes and volcanoes. And what is really important about this particular landscape is that it's also not only important for geologists, because we look at stratovolcanoes as kind of interesting ways in how to look at how plate tectonics is manifesting in the landscapes that we live in. And stratovolcanoes are formed in regions of the earth where the oceanic crust is pulled beneath the continental crust, which creates the volcanoes. For Maori, Kora Ruapeu is a way of understanding how the earth is expressing itself. And so this particular mountain, this particular volcano, as it expresses itself through volcanic eruptions or lava flows or ash clouds, Maori believe that this is Ruamoko expressing himself. And so the way the site is managed in terms of communities and people that live in its vicinity, Ruamoko is allowed to express itself. So people are encouraged not to live in areas where there may be lava flows or lahars, which are flows of ash and rock from the top of the mountain itself. So essentially, Maori believe that we as people need to adjust to how the earth, and in this case, a stratovolcano, expresses itself. If we go to the other side of the world, to California in North America, this is perhaps one of the most magical stories I encountered as I was researching and writing the book. This is Tisayak. So she's a granite intrusion, which pretty much makes Yosemite one of the most iconic landscapes in the world. She's also known in the Western language as Half Dome. Now, Tisayak is an ancestor of the Awinichi people, who are now known today as the Miwok First Nations in California. Now, Tisayak geologically formed through granitic intrusions into the crust. So these are essentially plumes of semi-molten magma that rose up, intruded into the Earth's crust, and couldn't necessarily break through to form a volcanic eruption. What happened is that magma got trapped just underneath the Earth's crust in layers of rock or in magma chambers, as in this case. And that magma took about 2 to 3 million years to cool down. And as it did, crystals began to grow in that rock. And this is what we see when we see granites all over the world. You see them sparkling with beautiful crystals. Now, the story of Tisayak, in the memories and the stories of the Awinichi people, goes as follows. Tisayak was a woman traveling with her husband through the Yosemite Valley, and they both became very hungry and thirsty as they had been walking for a very long time. And as Tisayak walked a bit further than her husband, she came across a lake, and she was so thirsty she began to drink from the lake. And she drank the lake dry. So when her husband arrived, he was very angry. He asked her, "Why did you not leave any water for me? Because I am also hungry and tired. I've been walking as much as you have." And so a great big argument ensued between the two of them. And her husband reached out for his walking stick and reached out to strike Tisayak. But she moved away, and instead she threw her basket at him in anger. Now, the Great Spirit, who was looking down upon this man and woman who were arguing so violently, he became very angered. And so he decided to make a lesson out of them. And he turned the husband into Washington Sentinel, which is on one side of Yosemite Valley, and he turned the woman, Tisayak, into this beautiful granitic peak. And the Awinichi people who had lived in the Yosemite Valley for about 5,000 or 6,000 years always looked to Tisayak to remind themselves of humility and regret, because it was a story that told them about kindness and tolerance towards each other. And what you can see on the face of the granite dome are these black streaks. And scientists know these black streaks as lichen, and the lichen have been there for thousands and thousands of years. And the native people, they see them as the tears of the woman who had been turned into stone. And this is probably one of the most beautiful intersections of science and spiritualities. It just gives me goosebumps whenever I retell that story. I think it's so beautiful. We go elsewhere in the North American continent. We go to South Dakota, and this is Six Grandfathers Mountain in South Dakota. Again, this is a granitic intrusion into that landscape that occurred a couple of 100 million years ago. Now, this particular mountain is incredibly sacred to the Lakota, the First Nations people in South Dakota. And this image shows us what this mountain used to look like. The Lakota believed that this place was incredibly sacred because what they could see in the rock formations were 6 key figures that would be guiding and counseling the members of their tribe. And quite often Lakota elders would go up to Six Grandfathers Mountain for something called vision questing, where they would commune and be with the rocks to find wisdom and guidance that would help them through the trials and tribulations that their people found themselves in. Now, today we know Six Grandfathers Mountain as Mount Rushmore, and as the Lakota were gradually dispossessed of their lands and the settlers came in, particularly to prospect for gold, they turned the mountain, this spiritual space, into an expression of power and supremacy over the indigenous people. And Lakota today still feel the harm being done to them because in the Fort Laramie Treaty, the entire region of the Black Hills area was promised to them as part of an exchange of lands with the settlers, the European settlers that came. And when gold was discovered on their indigenous lands, the Lakota were forced off those territories and the land was taken back by the US federal government. So there is a little bit of friction in this landscape. And I just wanted to touch upon that because landscapes are geologically fascinating, particularly for people like me that have studied the science. But we also need to recognize that landscapes also have immense cultural values, particularly for people, the First Nations, who have lived and been custodians of these landscapes for thousands of years. There was another sacred object that I wanted to share with you today, and this is Tamanawas, and he is an ancestor of the Grand Ronde tribe who are in Oregon in the United States. Tamanawas is actually a 4.5 billion-year-old meteorite that fell to Earth about 20,000 years ago. And Tamanawas in their language actually means visitor from the sky people. And this is a picture of Desiree Hernandez. She's age 7 and she's interacting with Tamanawas before a ceremony is held by the Grand Ronde delegation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Now, Tamanawas was regarded as an ancestor of the Chinook peoples, the Clackamas and the Chinook peoples, because as the ice sheets melted, this is where Tamanawas landed 20,000 years ago. It was during an ice age when ice sheets covered much of the North American continent. And Tamanawas were transported to northern Oregon as part of the Lake Missoula floods at the end of the last ice age. When the Clackamas and the Chinook people discovered Tamanawas, they thought it was an incredible being. They could see and sense a message from the heavens above. And so Tamanawas became revered within their cultures. And in this picture, what you can see is somebody from the Grand Ronde tribe worshipping a 3D print of Tamanawas at the Chachalu Cultural Center and Museum. And it's a really moving story because it's something that appeals to me as a geologist, but also as a very spiritual scientist, because when I went to meet with my contributor, Travis Stewart from the Grand Ronde tribe in March this year, I was able to hold some of the remains of Tamanawas in my hands. And the sad story about Tamanawas is that once the Clackamas and the Chinook people were dispossessed of their lands, Tamanawas was almost melted down by the Portland, Oregon Iron and Steel Company. And in the end, they sold Tamanawas to a collector who then donated it to the American Museum of Natural History. When it was under the care of the museum, Tamanawas had fragments sliced from it for scientific research. And great credit must be given to the Grand Ronde tribe for acquiring and having remains of their ancestor repatriated back to them. And so when I visited the Grand Ronde tribe in March, I was allowed to hold the remains of their ancestor in my hand. And that moment when I could meet the eyes of Travis Stewart, my contributor to the book, across the room, it was this extraordinary moment where I felt I've touched rocks like this before in my life. I've touched spiritual beings like this before in my life. And it reminded me of Mataji from my home temple, my mandir in my family temple. And this is Mataji. I'm just introducing you to her here. She's an incarnation of Mother Earth. And in Hinduism, there are almost 21 goddesses that represent Mother Earth itself, Ma Dharti. And in my hands, you can see how revered she is in my family. She has the sacred mark of sindoor on her body, and she's draped in a red cloth. And to hold her, to feel the privilege of holding Mother Earth in my hands is something that I can't quite describe. It's this awareness that I know that she is an object that has been on Earth for several 100 million years. I know her scientifically as a granodiorite that my mum picked up from Wales, but I also know her as a manifestation of the spirit of Mother Earth. And when I held the remains of Tamanawas in my hands, I just felt that connection, that we are unified all over the world, people who believe in the animacy of nature spirits, that the spirit of nature is all around us, but it's also inside us as well. And here we come to this question of how we begin to bridge science and spiritualities. This is Rainbow Bridge National Monument in Utah, and the First Nations people see these bridges as gateways, portals, if you like, to other worlds. First Nations leaders will never walk under these bridges or arches. Rather, they will stand by them and commune with the rocks as part of vision questing to gain knowledge and wisdom about how they can guide their own people in today's society through the trials and tribulations they experience. But also, science, in a way, tells us that as geologists, we also do the same process when we approach rocks. When I go to places like these bridges in Utah, I know that the sandstones were formed hundreds of millions of years ago, that they're a record of an ancient breath of wind that once carried sand grains across a landscape. And it's the textures and the colors and the feel of the rock that gives me this insight. So scientists, geologists, are pretty much following in the footsteps of First Nations people when they commune with the rock. And this is what I believe is that intersection between science and spirituality. Geology is a science that's all about the cycles of creation and destruction. And when I hold sand grains in my hand, there's this incredible moment where I feel that, yes, I am part of a society that understands that nature is part of an ongoing process that destroys and creates. Because these sand grains in my hand were once mountains. And of course, when I scatter them back onto the earth, they will one day be reborn as new rock. Now, this belief system that I particularly hold goes back to my own faith as a Hindu. And I just wanted to touch upon this just for a moment. In India, there are these sacred objects called Narmada pebbles that are held as incarnations of Lord Shiva. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of the geological background to these Narmada pebbles. They were formed about 145 million years ago in a rift valley system where the crust was very, very slowly being pulled apart. Now, as rivers flowed into that valley, they filled it up with sand and gravel. And over hundreds of millions of years, those river deposits were covered by flood basalts, because this was a tectonically active region where volcanoes and fissure eruptions were covering the landscape with lava. And those lavas covered these river sediments, and the heat and pressure of that process transformed these river sediments into quartzite, a really resistant kind of metamorphic rock. Now, what I find really fascinating about this process is that it embodies this idealism of destruction and creation. And when we look at the Narmada pebbles that are these sacred representations of Lord Shiva, they are found in the river, Narmada River in Madhya Pradesh. And what I find really fascinating as a geologist is that, yes, we have that geological story of how the quartzite formed. But for those believers and followers of Lord Shiva, the quartzite pebbles are actually shot through with quartz veins. And the quartz veins are said to represent the lines of ash that are spread across Shiva's forehead. And this is why they are so desired and so sought after by followers of Lord Shiva. They are seen as sacred representations, his incarnation on the planet Earth. Now, the other really interesting object that you can see in the Ancient India exhibition is a shaligram. And the origins of shaligrams are actually fossilized ammonites, fossil ammonites. And they formed, you can find them, or communities have been able to find ammonites in the Himalayas for thousands of years. And the reason for this is as follows. As the Indian plate, hundreds of millions of years ago, moved slowly northwards, it would eventually collide with the Eurasian plate. But in between the two continents, essentially, was an ocean, was a body of water where these strange creatures from the Jurassic period were living at the bottom of the ocean. And as those two plates collided together, the ocean sediments were uplifted, and eventually they would create the foothills of the Himalayas. Of course, with those sediments being uplifted, what went with them? But the fossils, of course. And so communities for thousands of years have been discovering fossil ammonites. Now, if we look at this beautiful object that is in the Ancient India exhibition, we can see a carving of Lord Vishnu into the ammonite itself. And this object is so sacred because the ammonite for these people represented a nature spirit, a serpent. And so through carving Vishnu on the other side of the fossil, they were embodying his incarnation on earth. And I simply love this. I spent quite a long time looking at this object when I visited the exhibition. Another kind of story that I want to share with you is this story of the limestones, and the limestones in India, which are very much used throughout the beautiful objects you see in the exhibition. The limestones date back to about 1.8 to 1.4 billion years ago. And I've just put a little video in there to show you what the rock originally would have looked like before it was carved into those beautiful forms. This was a region, this was a time when life was in its most primitive form, and these single-celled organisms were called stromatolites, and you can see that in that picture on the right-hand side in that video. Now, stromatolites were single-celled organisms existing in these very shallow basins of water that became essentially drains for rivers flowing from the mountains that surrounded them. And you can just see that basin that I refer to just circled there. And this particular basin, the stromatolites would flourish, they would grow, they would trap sediments into their algal mats and bloom in their millions. And over time, they would compress to form a limestone. So you get to see layers of these stromatolites in the raw rock that we can see in the right-hand side. Now, if we look at some of the beautiful artwork showcased in the exhibition, what you can see are the layers of these stromatolites. And as a geologist, I find this absolutely stunning. It's a stunning representation of geology and art together, because what the artist has done, the artisan has done, is essentially worked with the fabric and the texture of the rock to really enhance the features of the multiple-headed cobra that you can see carved into the limestone. You really get a sense of reptilian skin, don't you? And I think the rock, the features in the rock add to that. It's really very, very beautiful. We can also see this manifesting in this beautiful carving of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. Sorry about my pronunciation there. I get really excited about the rocks and then sometimes I forget about my word pronunciations. But what you can see here, again, this is a limestone from the same area that the previous piece of artwork was carved from. What you can see is how some of the layers of the limestone, and I think looking at them, they are stromatolites. What we can see is how the artist has worked with the fabric of the rock to enhance features of this figure. You can see the muscles, you can see the shape of the leg, the calf muscles, the face itself. There are so many beautiful features of the bodily form that are working in harmony with the rock. And that's what I find so thrilling about when we begin to bring science of the geology and how the limestone formed together with how the artisans were crafting the rock. If we come to one of the pieces that is actually from a different part of Asia, this is one that I wanted to speak to actually, because it's quite unusual to see some of the pieces in the exhibition formed from volcanic rocks, because a lot of the pieces that I saw were formed from sandstones and limestones. Now, this particular piece is formed from what I call a volcanic tuff, and it was a piece that was discovered in Java. Now, Java is located on the Ring of Fire, and that particular rock that the piece is made from is formed from volcanic eruptions of ash and rock. Now, the volcanoes along the Ring of Fire form because the oceanic crust is sinking very slowly. It's being pulled beneath into the mantle, and as it melts, the kind of, I would say, globules of magma, they rise up towards the Earth's crust and intrude and break through and then form volcanoes. And this is how these rocks form. So the rock that you're going to see in the next picture is formed from the eruptions of ash and pumice and lava. What we see in this beautiful representation of Ganesh is this exquisite use and understanding of the rock itself. This particular figure is carved from what I called volcanic tuff. And when I went to see Ganesh in Java at the exhibition, I noted just the subtle beauty of how the artisan has created so many of the details here. Now, volcanic tuff can be very well, it lends itself to very intricate carving because it is relatively a soft to carve. I mean, when we consider other rocks like limestone, which can be a little bit more tricky, it's a little bit more resistant, but the volcanic tuff is slightly easier to carve. And this is why we see these beautiful, intricate details. For example, Ganesh's fingers are so beautifully carved. You can see his toes. You can even see some of the details in upon the chair on which he's sitting and the crown that adorns his head. What I find really fascinating about this piece is that if you go to other areas of the British Museum and you explore some of the other artworks, particularly Hoa Hakananaya from Rapa Nui, that particular object as well is also carved from volcanic tuff, ancient volcanoes that erupted on Rapa Nui. So it gives us this sense of global connection through rock. So volcanic tuff is a rock that many people all over the world, in how they were expressing their love for nature and their understanding of spirituality in nature, they were using these rocks as a way to manifest those belief systems. And I just find that terribly exciting and terribly unifying in a way, because it makes us feel and it makes us sense that just like how I held the remains of Tamanawas in my hands and I looked in Travis Stewart's eyes, he's a curator and the guardian of Tamanawas, I could feel this sense of connection that no matter where we are, no matter who we are, we feel this connection with nature and with nature spirits. And I think when we look at objects like this, it's this beautiful sense that there were communities all over the world who had a reverence for rock and landscape and were using those materials as an expression of that joy and that connection that they felt with the earth. So that's what gives me such a thrill when I walk through the exhibition and I could see the limestones and the sandstones and this volcanic tuff. I thought, I've seen these rocks elsewhere in the world. I've seen them celebrated in other cultures. And I think that's the beauty of this exhibition, is that it just gives us this moment in time to center ourselves, particularly in ancient India, but it also opens our eyes to so many different cultures that understand and revere nature in a way that perhaps we could look towards. And I just want to come on to this final slide because I've been working with a number of Indigenous people from all over the world. And this is a statement that was given to me by Kingi Biddle of the Ngai Whaikau Iwi in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I was working with Kingi to understand Maori belief systems about animacy in nature. And this statement that he gave me that I can share with you today is imbued with mana. It's imbued with tapu. It's a sacred statement. He says, rocks do whisper. We've forgotten to listen to what they are saying. And I found it so profound to hear this from him because I thought, that's how I feel. And in my hands, what you can see is a piece of vesicular basalt. That essentially means it's a volcanic rock that was collected when I was 13 years old in Kenya. I hold that rock today as a some 50-year-old woman, and it's whispering to me that I did what I set out to do, to become a geologist, but also to carry the stories of rock with me for my life. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening to me.
That was so interesting. I've got a whole page of notes
Oh,
that I was
thank you,
taking
Sushma.
down as you were talking. I thank you so much. Honestly, it really, when we first met, it's a few years ago now, I remember you talking about your project, and it really made me think about all of these sacred sculptures that I'm fortunate enough to curate in a completely different way. And um, I think one of the many things that I've noted down as you were talking is this. When you talked about how you felt such a spiritual connection with the rock when you touched it, and I thought, oh my God, that's really interesting, because actually, in for Hindus, in particular, when the rock is shaped into the form of a deity, it's carved in particular ways, particular kind of sizes and stuff like that. But also there's a particular ceremony that takes place, so
Yes.
which imbues the rock with almost like a living quality. So people
Mm,
believe that actually it's the god is alive, it comes to life, and actually it's the touching of it, because not only do you look directly at the deity carved from rock in the eyes as part
mm,
of veneration, but also you would go and touch the feet as well. And
mm.
actually, it's this. I never really thought about how the type of the rock, the fact that you're communicating with nature, like the
Yeah,
ultimate, I suppose, the building blocks of life, literally, when you're talking about
yeah,
that this limestone made from the stromatolites, but also
yeah.
part of everything that we walk on. It's
Mm.
really kind of changing how I think about kind of gods and enlightened teachers created and shaped from rock.
I think that's extraordinary that I've been able to do that, Sushma. Thank you for sharing that. And I have obviously I don't live with my mum anymore. She keeps Mataji in her own temple, but I have Mataji here, my own veneration of Mother Earth. And you're absolutely right. What we do, or what I do as a Hindu, is that I embrace my faith, and I have done more so as I've been writing this book. And I genuinely believe that, even as a scientist or a spiritualist, I am touching this rock and I'm feeling the wisdom of hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history in my hand, but also the wisdom of my ancestors flowing through me to give me a greater sense of kinship with nature. And that's why it's so special.
I think also there's a couple of things, the story you were telling from Aotearoa in New Zealand about, staying out of the way and letting the volcano express itself. There's so much common sense in that as well, because you hear about stories from the Andaman Islanders during the awful tsunami that unfortunately happened a few years ago. And where there's a lot of people, they felt the earth shaking and the sea recede. They weren't sure what was going on. It's actually quite interesting. So more people went towards the beaches, whereas actually for them, stories had been passed down. I think this might have been true in Japan as well, but that might be a faulty memory there.
Mm,
But it had been handed down over generation after generation that if the earth shakes and the waters recede, look for the higher ground
mm,
and go there. And so many of them were, thankfully able to, that their lives were
mm,
saved because of that learning. So actually, there's so much we can remember, and it has an impact on our own lives when we listen, as you say, to
mm.
the whispers of rock and the voices of our ancestors.
I think that's a really beautiful expression of how science and spiritualities intersect because having studied Shintoism in Japan and how it manifests itself in nature spirits, I do believe there is a very strong part of Japanese culture that embodies that sense of resilience. Like those stories have been told over thousands of years of how to cope with and become more resilient in the face of, I would say, natural disasters. And so it's inbuilt into Japanese society. What do we need to do and how do we prepare ourselves for when nature expresses itself? And I think it's something that we can all really look towards these ancient belief systems and this reverence for nature that we seem to have just lost touch with slightly.
And yet it's not far below the surface, because once you
No.
start telling these stories, and all of a sudden you think, oh, so that's what it meant. Now I understand. Oh, it's fascinating. I think there was when we were talking about unfortunately the deity that was unfortunately sort of taken into collection and partly destroyed, it kind of reminds me of when sacred images in the subcontinent are damaged in some way, for whatever reason, accidentally damaged, whatever it might be. It's interesting that what tends to happen is you don't completely destroy or just leave it to one side. You tend to bury it back in the earth. So it's almost this idea that the rock goes back to where it kind of came from, and it's normally kind of buried underground, or it might be placed in a riverbed, which again, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, having heard you,
Yeah.
is another source of a lot of these stones which are later carved.
I love that because what governs every single aspect of life on Earth is the rock cycle. And essentially, rocks are created and destroyed in multiple processes at timescales we can't imagine, and sometimes we can imagine. But essentially, destruction, it sounds like such a negative word. It sounds so frightening. But actually, in order to create new rock, new landscapes, new opportunities, we do need to destroy something in order to create that opportunity. And here I'll give you an example. I live on the Jurassic coast, and there are regular cliff falls that happen along the coastline. When those rocks collapse, the waves will wash away that rock fall, but what they'll do is they'll transport the gravels, the sands, and even the fossils further down the coastline to form a different beach. And so this kind of process of renewal and rebirth is something we see again and again spoken about through legends and stories and songs across cultures across the world. And I find that level of understanding and sophistication of how to work within those processes, particularly in indigenous cultures, is quite extraordinary. And as scientists, we've almost come to the game quite late because those ideas, were formulated several hundred years ago, but they had been spoken about for thousands of years previously.
Oh, I love that. I think this idea of the destruction and the recreation of Earth and stuff, it reminds me of the stories connected with the Hindu god Vishnu. And there are 10 incarnations of Vishnu, and one of them is Vraha, which is the boar-headed deity. And
Oh,
in the hot pink section of the exhibition, my favourite colour, there's a really gorgeous sandstone sculpture actually of Vraha. And actually, if you look closely on his shoulder, he's kind of looking up with his beautiful boar head, and he's rescuing the personification of the earth, which is the goddess Bu, from where she was placed in a cosmic ocean by an anti-god. I mean, the stories are incredible;
epic.
they are just so fabulous. And he's rescuing her, and there are so many different kind of ideas which are coming together, all of which come down to nature, because the sculpture is made from this gorgeous reddish pink sandstone. It's slightly mottled, which is from a region around Mathura in northern India. And then you've got the idea of the personification of earth, but then you have this idea of an animal headed deity. And thinking about the pose, sort of, lifting her on his tusks. And it kind of reminds you of the boars, the wild boars, when they're throwing up clods of earth as they're searching for tubers to eat. And so you have so many different things coming together
So many.
for people through these stories. And Vishnu is wonderful because, every time we all get ourselves into trouble, humankind, the earth in different ways, this god comes down and rescues us. So it's like, hooray! Thank you very
I
much because we need it.
Yeah, we could do with a bit of Vishnu action today, couldn't we?
We really could. Amazing. I just wanted to briefly talk about that stunning Ganesh sculpture that you mentioned from Java. And I think one thing I think lighting and the way certain images are displayed, wherever they are, has such an impact on how you see them and think about them. And it was fascinating to hear about the creation of that beautiful volcanic stone. And I thought what's really interesting, the way he's lit in the show, it kind of really reminds me of elephant skin. And you sort of
Mm,
wonder, those craftspeople in the past, because that dates from about 11th or 12th century.
wow.
You sort of wonder, were they looking at these stones and seeing the quality of
Mm,
elephant skin or something? Is that one of the reasons they selected it?
mm,
And I think that's probably true in so many different ways, because although a lot of sacred sculptures were and are painted or adorned in
mm,
different ways, whether they're dressed or you talked about the sindoor on your Mataji sculpture, for example. and yet you still come down to the craftspeople and an actual piece of stone and the qualities that they're seeing in it from the
Yeah.
Narmada stones or this beautiful
Mm.
sculpture of Ganesh.
I absolutely believe you're onto something there, and I think that's a whole PhD project because when we look into well, prehistory and archaeology, we absolutely know that these ancient artisans and tool makers had a very deep understanding of geology. And in the book, I write about flint tools from Orkney, and actually, those prehistoric tool makers were incredibly selective about the types of flints they chose and they used to create their tools and their objects and their artifacts. And I would imagine that that beautiful stone that Ganesh is carved out of, yes, it does remind you of, this kind of rumpled, rough skin. It has that texture, it has that quality. And I think the beautiful kind of that we know that obviously the color of the rock has changed because of weathering and being transported and being moved, but the texture of the rock is, they must have felt something about what the rock was giving in terms of its messages, in terms of physical, like, here is this deity that you can come here and you can worship and look in the eye and connect with the greater divine beings, but also this is part of you as well because this rock is all around you. If Ganesh was in his original context, we would be able to see those tufts, those volcanic tufts in the landscape all around us. And so the deity becomes part of us as well as being this divine being. And I find that quite mind blowing.
That is extraordinary. Thank you. And I'm going to actually show some sculptures which are in the exhibition that I would love to get your thoughts on. We talked about that really stunning sandstone, this lovely pinkish sandstone from in the regions of Mathura, and it's really, I mean, it's so famous. This sandstone. I think one of the things when you're looking at how to share quite unfamiliar art with different people. When we were working on the Houghton Gallery, which is the gallery of South Asia and China at the British Museum, the permanent one, when I was thinking about the displays, I was really thinking about the colours of the rock because
Mm,
actually, as you're walking through, so even subcontinent, obviously a massive space, but we
mm,
don't probably think very much about how different so much of the stone is around us in terms of colour. And actually, when you walk through, you've got the lovely grey, slightly sparkly schists. So it's really interesting to
mm.
hear from you about why they've got these lovely shiny inclusions in them. So I made a note of that as well. Um, and then you kind of walk through and you go to the Mattara region, and all of a sudden you've
Yeah,
got this lovely pinkish, reddish, mottled kind of stone. Then you carry on going up into slightly more central
yeah,
India, and it's a buff coloured sandstone.
yeah.
Then you go into Eastern India and it's this much darker granite as well. And you
Mm,
carry on going and you go down south to the southeast and you've got this lovely,
mm,
almost like a pale, whitish, creamy limestone as well.
mm,
And it's so interesting. It's almost like a way of directing people towards to kind of think, oh yes, you're in a different region now. The colours are
mm,
different. And
mm.
I just wondered, a slightly random question, may not maybe a daft one, but what gives this particular sandstone or any sandstone these gorgeous rich colours? Like some of them are mottled, some of this it's
Mm.
just the most beautiful warm reddish pink. Like what is that about?
Yeah, well, it's all to do with the chemical composition of the rock itself. So as it's forming, so this fine-grained sandstones, and this one is absolutely beautiful, and you can see that the texture of the sandstone has aided the artisan to do so many intricate details. And this sandstone was probably formed, I would say, in a desert environment, in an environment where you had grains of a very similar size cementing together, not so much an environment where you would have had flowing water. So flowing water tends to transport, if you go to a river nearby, you'll see all manner of size of grains on the riverbed. And what we see here is quite a homogeneous sandstone. And that pinkish color comes from the minerals inside the rock. And quite often what we see, if we're kind of looking at red and orange tones, it tends to be iron oxides. And when I was in Petra a few years ago, it's probably one of the most beautiful places where I've seen multicolored sandstones, and where you see blues and oranges, and it's extraordinary because those are the blues are down to manganese. So when we're looking at the types of rocks that the artisans are choosing. Firstly, they're choosing rocks within their local regions because obviously it's incredibly expensive and arduous to transport rocks inside into a region in order to carve the things that you want to carve. So you're going to use locally what's around you. So when you spoke about the exhibition, you're traveling through the different artworks and you're seeing a representation of different types of geologies. Well, essentially, what you're looking at is a geological map of India, as
Yeah.
well as an expression of the artistic form that the artisans were doing. But essentially, the colors of the different sandstones are down to the minerals within the rock as it formed.
Oh, amazing. Thank you very much. Really helpful question answered. And I wanted to also ask about, you talked about the softness and the hardness of different stones and rocks and those kind of materials. This is another limestone piece, and it's the same limestone as the two that you showed in your lecture. I just wondered, these particular sculptures carved in this particular kind of rock, they're renowned for the incredible detail. And you can see this one. I mean, this is about 2,000 years old, and you can
Yeah.
still see so much incredible detail, all the figures, all the expressions, the clothes, jewelry, ornaments, the lot. I just wondered, is there a reason why this particular limestone is so soft? Like what gives it its particular texture? Is it the way different materials are kind of bonded and joined together, or
Mm.
what is that?
Yeah, well, limestone is what we would call a chemical sedimentary rock. So it forms when dissolved calcium carbonate in water, the molecules, as it usually forms well, stromatolites live in warm, shallow waters. Let's start at the beginning. So stromatolites are single-celled organisms. They were one of the very first organisms that began to evolve on Earth billions of years ago, and they exist in warm tropical waters. Now, if the waters begin to cool down, the calcium carbonate that dissolves from their bodies um, molecules begin to kind of become attracted together, and they deposit to form these very fine-grained limestones at the bottom of basins or seas. Now, let's fast forward to this rock itself in its complete form. And what you see is these beautiful, intricate carvings in a rock that allows the artisan to express him or herself. I would assume it's a him, but the homogeneity of the rock itself. So here we haven't seen that the artisan has chosen a very finely layered stromatolite like we've seen in those other artworks. They specifically chosen a piece where the limestone is what we would call as geologists massively bedded. So it's a big piece of limestone that has homogeneity across its structure. So you're not so different, I would say, inclusions of different things or different layers in the limestone are not interfering with the way the artisan has created this sculpture. And I say limestone is quite a soft rock. It can be, depending on its texture. But because this is so intricately carved, it's either down to the softness of the rock. So limestone has yielded to the hands of this incredible artisan. Um, and I think that it's the two, it's the artisan working together with the rock and understanding how it behaves under his hands. And this is quite extraordinary because when you talk to stonemasons today, and I've met a couple over the research for this book, they do talk about this relationship they have with the rock. They can hear it, like you say, sing to them. It speaks to them. And as they're doing these very intricate carvings, they can sense, perhaps I shouldn't be pushing too far into this. Perhaps I need to just relax the pressure that I'm trying to do to achieve this part of the work. So I would imagine that artisan had a very close and intimate relationship and understanding of what this rock was.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you so much. Just got one or two left, don't worry.
Yeah.
I've got this one, and we weren't sure what the stone was. It's potentially sandstone or potentially even granite, but I was really intrigued by the idea of the Narmada stones that you were talking about. And then I thought I'd put in this shivling. So it's Shiva in the form of a lingam, which actually means symbol. And you can see what's interesting is like a snake which is kind of winding round the
Mm.
shaft. Then above it, it's kind of mouth open with the forked tongue spreading out over the top. And you can there are different the top part is quite smooth because that would have been protruding above the surface, whereas the bottom part's quite roughly carved because it's probably based inside the floor of a shrine. And I mean, this is quite a hard rock. It's
Yeah,
very heavy to hold.
yeah.
And yet they've managed to kind of smooth it out. And it's almost like they're trying to make it resemble a feature of the landscape, whether it's, one of the Narmada stones or a kind of this kind of shaft shape natural rock. And I just wondered, I don't even know if you know this, so random question, but how do you go about intricately carving and smoothing down such incredibly hard rock? I mean, if that's something you know much about, absolutely fine. If not, don't worry about it at all. I'm just asking all the questions I've always wanted to ask.
It's okay. So I've kind of spoken to various stonemasons as I've kind of gone through this process, and they are using different tools and techniques to smooth and shape the rock. Usually it's a very delicate chisel. So they are using, like I would say, a mallet and using a chisel to begin to take away the bulk of the rock. And then when you get to the finer details, it is a process of skill and care and different tools and using, I would say, I mean, these days they would use, kind of different type of papers to achieve that very smooth, glossy finish that you see on those carvings. But I think back in these days, several hundred years ago, they would be using very fine tools to chip away and to get the intricate detail that you have. When I actually saw this at the exhibition, I wasn't quite sure. I knew it was a crystalline rock. I wasn't sure whether that black coloring was painted on or stained, but it certainly felt like a crystalline granite. So that's why we kind of see this almost sense of holistic. It just feels like this entire piece has been beautifully carved without any obstruction or any kind of obstacles presented by the rock itself. So that's why I kind of thought this is a crystalline granite, or because I wasn't sure whether the black was painted on, it could have been a basalt as well.
No, the top bit was definitely painted,
Okay,
and you can see the natural colour
yeah,
kind of
then
standard at
that's
the
a granite.
bottom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
And
this is one of my favorites.
no, I love it. And do you know what I love about the fact that you've got these kind of ancient sea creatures up in the Himalayas, just this one place, and actually it's the the beautiful curve, the coil.
Yeah,
It resembles Vishnu's chakra weapon, the discus
yeah,
weapon, and you get
yeah,
them in such different sizes. You get massive ones, little
yeah,
ones,
yeah.
and as you say, this lovely one, it's also carved on the other side.
What I love about shaligrams are for geologists, we see the fossil ammonites up in the Himalayas as this evidence for how India collided with the Eurasian plate some, 50 million years ago, and the uplifting of those marine sediments to then, end up in the foothills of the Himalayas. That in itself is quite mind-blowing. And then this kind of beautiful connection with, the followers of Vishnu seeing his chakra in these manifestations, and I just find that utterly magical how the two can intersect.
I think it just goes to show that, when you've got people walking through different places, wherever they might be, whether they're encountering ammonites or anything else it might be, that kind of these stories that we have already developed has such an impact on how we then interpret what we're looking at, how we shape it. Because if they were not worshippers of Vishnu, they might have been other people, and they would look at these, and a whole range of other stories would have kind of
Yeah,
emerged as
absolutely.
well. And then you've got on the other hand, this is part of what you were talking about in your lecture, is the other way round. The landscape itself helps shape some of these stories, and you venerate the mountain or the
Yes.
volcano and understand the lessons that it is sharing
Yeah,
with you, and
yeah.
it impacts how you end up living your life. So I think this twofold, I suppose, play that we have with nature. I think it has such a big influence on our lives in ways that we often don't think about so much anymore.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, the other thing we haven't touched upon is manifestations of deities within the Himalaya. So Mount Kailash, which is a very sacred place for Buddhists, for Hindus. I'm not sure about Jainism, but it is the spiritual home of Lord Shiva. So, the fact that the Himalayas are formed from the collision and the destruction of an ocean that lay between those two continents. You've got the two continents colliding, the mountain, the mountains forming from crusts being squeezed and compressed and uplifted to form Mount Kailash. I mean, that the manifestation of a Hindu Buddhist deity plus the science, I just love that. It excites me beyond words.
And it's wonderful because a lot by, lovely coincidence or not, I don't know, the god Shiva is associated with cycles of creation and
Yes.
destruction because when
Yeah.
he dances,
Yes.
that's the endless cycle that takes place. So
That's
I love
right.
the fact that they've kind of come
Yeah.
together quite perfectly.
Yeah, it is perfect.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you so much. I have to say, I've really, really enjoyed our discussion today, and I've learned so much from you too. So thank you.
Thank
And
you.
also thank you everyone else for joining us for this wonderful event today, and especially to Anjana for sharing her fantastic book as well with us. The book is available to buy at all good bookshops, and I'm also glad to say that Ancient India Living Traditions is open until the 19th of October, so please do come and see it if you can. And also, it's free on Fridays. So, book your ticket for free on any Fridays. And of course, members go free anytime. Thank you so much from me. And I don't know if, Angela, you have any words for the ending as well.
Well, thank you very much for having me along. I think just this intersection of art, of archaeology, of spirituality and science is something that I think should bring joy to everybody's hearts. Certainly has to mine.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.